Our NATO leaders are set to meet in The Hague this month, where the bloc is expected to increase military budgets following pressure from US President Donald Trump, with a planned expenditure of 4.7% of GDP on defense this year. Poland's outgoing President Andrzej Duda spoke exclusively with CNA's Yasmin Jonkers on how he hopes NATO allies will follow suit.
We in Central Europe indeed are afraid. Looking at our historical experiences with Russia, we are afraid of a potential Russian aggression. Having said that, our obvious response and reaction was, right from the beginning when I was elected President of Poland since 2015, our response was to modernize our armed forces, and we decided to increase our defense spending. Of course, that coincided with a decision made earlier by NATO, and we have been members of NATO for 26 years now. So NATO decided to raise defense spending across all NATO members up to the level of minimum 2% of GDP. So we started to spend that amount right away. So since the beginning of my presidency, we were at the level not lower than 2% of GDP, and then we started to modernize our armed forces in a very intensive way because we were aware of the growing Russian imperialism. Please remember that it was not only Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014, but before, in 2008, Russia attacked Georgia, and Russian tanks were rolling towards Tbilisi. Part of Georgia is still occupied, as a matter of fact, by Russia. That is why we are building up our resilience. We are building up our security through creating a system of deterrence. We are part of NATO, and NATO is a defensive alliance. We do not want to attack anyone, but we want to do everything to ensure that we are not attacked. So this is a paradox. We are building up our military potential. We are spending, indeed, 4.7% of our GDP on defense today. This is the highest level of defense spending vis-a-vis GDP in NATO right now. We are doing all of that in order to protect ourselves so that we are not attacked. In other words, we have been accumulating the modern defensive equipment. We're increasing the potential of our armed forces so that our armed forces don't have to fight. However, Polish people agree with this huge level of defense spending. They're making huge sacrifices because that money could be spent on education, the money could be spent on health protection, but still we are spending it on building up the potential of our armed forces. I wrote a letter to Secretary General of NATO early this year. I wrote to Mark Rutte, and I made an appeal to include this in the agenda of the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague, so that the level of spending reaches the level of at least 3% of GDP across all member states. Mark Rutte proposed even a higher level, minimum of 3.5% of GDP on defense, plus 1.5% on goals related with defense, research and development, also development of defense industry. I believe this is a right move, and we advocate it. I hope that this will be included in the agenda of the upcoming NATO summit in The Hague. This summit will happen in a few weeks, but I hope that finally this decision will be made and that NATO countries will adopt this decision.
What role do you think Russia's ally China can do in helping to end this war in Ukraine?
Over the period of the 10 years of my presidency, I visited China many times. On 2 occasions, I paid official visits, and I held official meetings with President Xi Jinping. We talked many times. President Xi Jinping also visited me on an official visit in Warsaw. And let me say the following. I have never had any doubts that China is such a big superpower that it is able to have an impact on the situation in Russia, and because of that it is able to be the stabilizing factor which can contribute to ending Russian aggression against Ukraine. And I still think the same. I believe that China plays a huge and incredibly important role in stabilizing the world and in keeping peace in the world, and I count very much when it comes to bringing the war to an hand when it comes to finding a peaceful solution. I count very much on China playing a creative and positive role here.